Alrighty, in this video what we're going to do is we are going to put together the animation controller for our player. So, what do I mean by that? Well, right now if we hit play, all we're going to see him do is execute his idle animation over and over and over again. He's not going to start walking, he's not going to start flailing, and he's definitely not going to start exploding like a frog. So, what we need to do is we need to jump into our animator. Now our animator window, like what we saw before, allows us to create transitions between each one of our states. Now remember, when we click on the animator, we'll want to make sure that we have our player selected. So we'll click on our player to make sure that what we're looking at is the animation controller for our player. Alrighty, so what I'm going to do is we are going to orient these around just a little bit. So we're going to have player idle, player walk, and we're going to have player death. However, player fire is not going to be on this layer, so I'm going to delete this. We'll talk about layers here in a moment. So we need to come up with a way to transition between these four states. What I need to do is I need to create a variety of parameters. So I'm going to click this plus button. The first parameter I'm going to create is a float, and it's going to be called speed. This is going to be the normalized speed, which is going to be a value between 0 and 1, indicating if he is idle or if he is walking at his maximum speed. The next parameter I need is a boolean called isDead, and the isDead boolean will indicate, well, if he's dead. And that'll be used to transition to and from player death. Finally, we need two more of these parameters actually. We're going to need another boolean for isGrounded, because remember, we want him to flail when he's in the air. So we're going to use the isGrounded boolean to make transitions between flailing and walking, or specifically flailing and idling. Finally, we're going to create one last parameter, which is going to be a trigger called fire, and that's going to be executed when he shoots. Okay, so let's make our transitions. I'm going to right-click player idle, which is our default transition. If it's not your default transition, be sure to right-click and set as default. Then I'm going to make a transition between idle and walk. Then I'm going to click on this transition, and I'm going to open up its conditions, and I'm going to select exit time. Instead of exit time, I want to check speed. So I want to say if speed is greater than let's say 0.01, then we want to transition from idle to walk. Next up, we want to make a converse transition. So I want to click on player walk, right click, make transition, and transition back to idle. Then click this little arrow, and what we're going to do is we're going to say if speed, so we're going to select speed, is less than 0.01, transition from player walk back to player idle. Okay, so let's see what happens when we hit play now. Or wait a sec, we won't be able to see anything because we haven't actually set the speed parameter yet. So we're not going to worry about that right now. We're going to set all our parameters at the end of the video so that we can keep as much time as we have inside of the animator window, so we make sure that our transitions are appropriate. So next up, let's talk about our jump. Our jump is going to happen when isGrounded turns false. When isGrounded turns false, we want him to flail. So I need to make a transition from both player idle and player walk into the player jump. To do that, I'm going to right-click player idle, say make transition, and then click on player jump. Then I'm going to click on this transition arrow and say isGrounded equals false. So if he's on the ground idling and all of a sudden he becomes in the air, he will start flailing. Like you would too if you were all of a sudden in the air after being on the ground. Then we're going to go from player walk to player jump by right-clicking player walk, clicking make transition, and clicking back over to player jump. Then I'm going to click on this transition arrow, say isGrounded, and select false. Now remember, only one state can really be active at a single time in the animator. So once we get to player jump, we so far don't have any transitions from player jump back to either player walk or player idle. I'm going to kind of cheat and make only one transition from player jump back to player idle by right-clicking player jump, clicking make transition, and clicking back on player idle. Then this condition, which I'm going to select this arrow, is going to be isGrounded is true. Now I'm not going to have to create two transitions I could create two transitions, one from player jump to player idle and one from player jump to player walk. But if we go from player jump to player idle and his speed is greater than 0.01, it'll just go back from idle all the way to walk. So that's what we want to have happen. Okay, so this actually completes, this triangle completes his walk transition, his jump transition, and his idling transition. But what about his death? Well, I want him to explode regardless of what state we're currently in. I want him to explode when he dies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click this special any state. Now the any state, when you make a transition from any state to another state, you're creating a transition from any state to another state. Again, another aptly named concept. So what it means is regardless of whether we're in idle, walk, or jump, if we have a condition from any state to another state, that transition will override everything. So what I want to do is right-click any state, hit Make Transition, and select over to player death. Then the condition of this transition is going to be, instead of exit time, it's going to be is dead is true. So that's this condition. Now once we're locked in the player death, how do we get out of death? Well, a way to get out of death is to create a transition from death to player idle. Click on this transition and select is dead is false. So now, when we're in death, we go back to idle when the isDead parameter becomes false. So that's exactly what we want. There's one last thing we have to do. The behavior of Unity animation is that when you're in a state, it'll continuously loop that state over and over and over again. But we don't want that for our death. We want him to explode and then stay exploded. To make him stay exploded, we need to make sure that his player death animation does not loop. That's actually pretty easy to do. All we have to do is come in here to our project window, open up our animations folder, find his player death animation, and uncheck loop time. By doing that, our explosion will happen, and then it'll just sit here in the state until it can transition out of the state. And it's going to be able to transition out of the state when the isDead parameter becomes false. Alrighty.
You are an animator.
Well, I mean, this is, state transition, not so much. But still, anyway. That's pretty much our state machine that we're looking at. We have death, idle, walk, and jump. We have one more state that we haven't dealt with yet, and that's the shoot state. So what happens when we shoot? Well, actually, I want the shoot state when we fire, when the fire trigger becomes true, like what you see down here, when that becomes true, I want him to shoot and have that shoot override any other state that he might be in. So in order to do that, instead of creating 1,000,001 transitions, I can actually just create a new layer. You see up here in the top left how we have layers? I'm going to go ahead and click this little plus button and create a new layer, and I'm going to call this the fire layer. Then I'm going to set the fire layer's weight to 1, meaning anything that gets animated inside this layer will override the properties of the base layers. And that's exactly the behavior I want. I want his hands to start working independently of what his body is doing. So how do we handle the fire layer? Well, the fire layer is actually going to have two states in it, not just one. It's going to have an empty state, and then it's going to have the fire state. So how do we do that? Well, first, I'm going to right-click anywhere here, and I'm going to say Create State, Empty. And I'm just going to leave it called New State. Most importantly, however, you'll notice it is yellow, meaning it is the default state. If it isn't the default state for you, right-click it and click Set as Default. Then, I want to drag my player fire from my project window into my animator. So I'll drag and drop it, and I now have a player fire state. Now what I want to do is I want to transition from new state into fire state by right-clicking Making Transition and dropping it on player fire. And then this arrow right here, I want to set the condition to fire. So when the player fires, basically this will override all of the other animations that might be applying to his hand. and it'll make his hand do what his hand does when he fires. Or really make whatever we want him to do happen, and override all the existing information. However, once he's shot, or once he's done something in his player fire, I want to right-click, make transition back to an empty new state, and I want to just set the exit time to 0.25. I mean, that's fine for us. We could also just uncheck atomic. This will make it look a little bit better, because unchecking atomic makes it so it can't transition until until player fire has been finished. So once player fire has been finished, it'll transition back into new state. And so that's exactly what we want. So now we have 2 layers and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 animations. All we have to do now is supply these 4 parameters from our player script, and our animations will magically work. So let's jump into Visual Studio. Eventually. Let's jump into Visual Studio, and let's jump all the way down to our player file. What we're going to need is we're going to need a reference to an animator. So in player, I'm going to say public animator. And this is going to allow us to control the parameters. Now I'm going to go to update, and at the bottom of the update method is where I want to start putting in some information. So at the bottom of the update method is where I want to set 3 of the parameters that we have. I want to say animator dot set boolean is grounded, and I want to set that to controller dot state dot is grounded. Then I want to set animator dot is, or set bool is dead to our is dead property that is conveniently already set for us from other code. Then I want to set the speed, but what do I want to set the speed to? Remember, I said I wanted to set the speed to a number between 0 and 1, where 0 represents his slowest movement, which is no movement at all, and 1 represents his maximum movement, which is his max speed. So I'm going to say animator set float speed, and I'm going to set it to mathf.absolute value underscore controller dot velocity dot x, and then I'm going to get out of the absolute value, and I'm going to divide it by max speed. That's going to give us a number between 0 and 1, which is exactly what we want. The last thing that we have to do is scroll all the way down in our code and find where we fire a projectile, and then set the fire trigger. So let's scroll all the way down to our fire projectile code. After we play the clip at point for our player's shoot sound, I want to say animator.setTrigger, and I want to pass in fire. And that's all the code that we have to do to create a fairly simple but non-trivial animation scheme. So let's jump back into Unity and see how this plays. Let's hit play. And okay guys, it's going to happen again. Unity is going to sit there and it's going to spin its wheels for a couple seconds. So I'll just fill those couple seconds in with some words of warning. When you depend on a property such as the animator of the player being set to a value, make sure that you go and actually set that value before you hit play. Otherwise, Unity locks up. You'll see we'll get a null unassigned reference exception because we have not actually set the player's animator to anything yet. So let's do that. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to collapse everything, all the other components. I'm going to find my animator. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to drop it on our new animator property for our player. Then I'm going to scroll all the way up to the top of the file and hit apply, so that our player now has, or all of our players, including the player on level 2, has all of the animation values set properly. Now let's hit play. Okay, and we have a walk cycle, and we have a flail cycle, and we can shoot, and let's see what happens when we die. And we just explode. Okay, so stuff is looking pretty good here, but it will look a little bit off for you guys, and that is because our walk cycle actually doesn't match up with how fast our player is going. But the fact is that our player can actually start walking slowly, or in fact start not walking at all, completely idle, and slowly ramp up his speed. So what I want to do is I want to blend between two animations, one where he's walking and one where he's running. And I want to base the blending of that off of the speed variable, which again, I conveniently set as a value between 0 and 1, which lines up perfectly with how we do blend states. So let's show a really simple example of how we can make the player walk faster while he is moving faster and slower while he's moving slower. Let's go back into the animator and make sure again that we have our player selected. Otherwise we won't see this. So make sure we have our player selected. Let's come back up to the base layer and let's look at his walk. What I want to do is I want to replace this player walk animation state entirely with a blend tree. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click player walk and say create new blend tree in state. I'm going to click that and you're going to be like, what happened? What changed? Well, what changed was that now on the top right of our inspector, it says motion equals blend tree, and it no longer says motion equals walk. So how do we edit the blend tree that we just created? Well, it's actually kind of unintuitive, and it took me a little while to figure it out on my own when I was learning this stuff. But what you do is you simply double click on your player walk, and now you'll get the blend tree editor. Now, right now, the blend tree is empty. That's because we're not blending in any animations yet. So let's fix that. I want to go ahead and hit this plus right here under motions and say add motion field. Then I want to find my player walk in my project window, and I want to click and drag it all the way up here to where it says none. And now suddenly we now have a player walk that's connected to our blend tree. Let's go ahead and add another motion field. So I'm going to click this plus again, say add motion field, and scroll all the way down to player walk. Again, the same animation, and then drag it all the way up to the top and drop it right there. All right, we now have a blend tree. But how does the blend tree work? Well, the blend tree is going to blend between one or multiple, even if you wanted to, but in this case, one of two animations. We can see the way that it blends up here in this diagram, which looks like it's just a linear interpolation between the two, which is exactly what we want. Now, what value does it choose to blend based off of? Well, you can see right there, based off the speed. It chose the speed because the speed was the only float parameter it could find. If you have multiple float parameters, you would have to come up here to the parameter dropdown and select a different one. But in this case, since speed was the only one it could find, that's the one that it chose for us. Now you might be thinking, why are we blending between two of the same animation? That seems kind of pointless. Nothing would change. And of course, that's true. At this point, there would be no difference. However, there's a very convenient property right here staring at us, which is the animation speed. And I can come down here and I can select, like let's say 5. Let's say when he is moving at full speed, his walk cycle is multiplied by 5 in terms of speed. There's a bunch of more options that we can play around with the blend tree, but I'm not going to go into any of the other ones. This is just a really simple example of how we can put together a simple blend tree between running and walking, but this tool is a lot more powerful than it appears to be. The final thing I want to point out with the blend tree interface is in order to get back to your normal state, you click this little breadcrumb trail at the top left hand of the screen. So just click on that, and we're back at base layer. Remember, double click to get into a blend tree, and then click on the layer name to get back into the layer. Now let's hit play and see what we get. Alright. Now the walk cycle definitely looks a whole lot better. It looks like he's actually walking in order to move from one point to another. And of course I just exploded like a frog because I ran into that buzzsaw. Alright guys, We now have the ability for the player to sit there. He kind of looks like he's dancing back and forth to the music. He now walks, and the speed of his walk is determined by his actual velocity, which is really cool. And also, he shoots little microphones by moving his hands a little bit up and down. So yeah. I think the last thing I want to do is I want to jump into our second level. Just double click on level 2, make sure to save all my changes, and make sure that our animation has been applied to our second level. Which, indeed it has.
That is a thing of beauty.
Alrighty. Well, that is animations in a nutshell. There's a whole lot more to say about animations, but I think that we captured pretty much the most basic elements of animations to get people started on making their own. Again, there's a lot more cool features you can play around with, but even just using the really simple features, you guys saw how we were able to add a whole lot of dynamic life to the game without even changing much code at all. In fact, we didn't change any code. We really just had to add some bits referencing our animators here and there, and then everything just worked. And we're able to go back and even change our animations after the fact just by opening up the really powerful, nice little animation window and changing the animation to do whatever we want, and everything will just magically work.
Nice.
So yeah, I think that just about wraps up all the stuff we want to do with animations, and we'll see you guys in the next video.